Order, order. Welcome, and it's a pleasure to have you here to talk about asbestos today for the Education Committee, and we're delighted that we have such a distinguished panel to help inform our deliberations on this subject. Can I say, should parents be concerned about the risks to their children from asbestos in our schools? And we tend to be quite informal here, so I hope you're comfortable with using first names. So, Michael.
It's certainly, Mr. Chairman, in my opinion, parents should be concerned. They certainly shouldn't panic over it, but they should be concerned about the fact that children are going to schools, and some schools the asbestos management is not up to speed. It's not effective, and in some schools it's actually not safe. And therefore, parents certainly should be informed about what asbestos is in their schools, and also what's been done to manage it. And if it's been managed correctly, then okay. But if it's not, then they should be concerned.
You're saying in some schools it's unsafe. Can you quantify that in any way and tell us on what evidence base you make that assertion?
Yes, indeed, Mr. Chairman. It's some schools, for instance, there's a recent case at Cwmcarn, which is a school in Wales, where they found that the heaters were emitting amosite fibres, and amosite is one of the amphiboles and up to 100 times more dangerous than chrysotile asbestos. And it's been emitting asbestos fibres into the rooms. Now, a warning was actually sent out about this in 1982 by the Health and Safety Executive, and yet they warned them they must seal the asbestos inside these heaters or remove it. And yet here we are in 2012, and these heaters were emitting asbestos fibres into the rooms. That is just one case. There are other cases where it's been shown, and someone phoned me very sadly last week about their wife, who was a primary school teacher, and she had died last year of mesothelioma, and she purely took books out of a stationery cupboard, and tests have been carried out that removing books from a stationery cupboard where there's asbestos insulating board at the back can emit 50,000 fibres in every cubic metre of air, and each one of us inhales about 20 cubic metres a day. And so cumulatively, over a long period of time, just from those two examples, you can get a significant exposure over a number of years. And so, there is a danger in some schools, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. On the quantifying point, do you have any idea how widespread the number of unsafe, how great is the number of unsafe schools?
Well, unfortunately, no, we do not. We have asked the government, one, to carry out an audit to find out the extent, type of condition of asbestos in schools, so they can actually prioritise and find out which are the schools most at risk. And in fact, the government has specifically excluded asbestos from the Property Data Survey Programme, and so they don't know the extent, and we don't know the extent. The number of schools that are not managing their asbestos also is an unknown, because once again, the Health and Safety Executive have carried out some proactive inspections, but when you consider the number of schools they've inspected, and we have 24,000 schools in this country, and they've just inspected a matter of 200, perhaps 300 schools, it's only a very small proportion. And so we don't really know, and the government doesn't know, of the standards of asbestos management. What we do know is the Asbestos Consultants Association, many of their members go into most schools in the country, and they are deeply concerned about the standards of asbestos management in many schools.
Thank you. Julian.
Thank you, Mr.
Well, I don't think that I disagree with the principle that something should be done about asbestos in schools, but the difficulty is...
Well, my question, sorry, just to remind you of it, it was some time ago, was should parents be concerned about the risk of asbestos exposure for their children?
Well, we don't know. I mean, the thing is, if you look at the national average trends in mortality from mesothelioma, which have gone down dramatically in recent years, because asbestos stopped being used about 1980, about 30 years ago, and we're now at last seeing a decline in the mesothelioma rate as a result of that.
And we do have the highest rate in the world, is that?
We've got the highest rate in the world. I was Australia, it's a dead heat. It's because we used, as Michael said, it's because we used large amounts of amosite. I mean, that's actually the principal problem. and it's in the material that's in schools.
You just mentioned Australia. I mean, don't the main asbestos in Australia?
Sorry?
Don't the main asbestos in Australia?
Yeah, but it hasn't got a great deal to do with that. I mean, they used it in the same way. They mined blue asbestos, but they used, with Britain and Australia between them, used half the world's production of brown asbestos, amosite. We put it in asbestos cement board and installed it in buildings, including schools, and that's the major problem now. Okay. So there's a dramatic decline in mesothelioma rates, but that doesn't really address this directly. When we look in lungs, in the general population, there's a tenfold reduction in the amount of asbestos in the lungs of people born after 1975 compared with people born around 1960. And the people born around 1960 are crucial because they're the first generation that didn't work with asbestos. I mean, they were born in 1962, you're sort of 18 in 1980 when asbestos had stopped use. So it's the first generation that was exposed environmentally, but didn't actually work with it. And so in terms of national death rates, people born since 1960 are the crucially informative ones, because that's the mesothelioma risk in people who grew up with asbestos in schools and in the environment for the first 15 years of their lives. And then, since 1980, have lived with the subsequent conditions. And what we're concerned with are the subsequent conditions, and the mortality data only tell us about what was happening 50 years ago. That's the problem.
Okay, thank you. Roger?
I think we've heard already mention of management of asbestos. It depends. If asbestos is currently being very well managed, then like any risk in school, it can be managed, and parents therefore shouldn't be concerned.
Michael's key point was if it isn't being managed, that there are unsafe schools. He gave specific examples and then said he couldn't quantify it because we simply don't have the information. So if you've got a combination of a number of schools which are clearly dangerous with a failure to know where those are or how many there are, then you have a position in which you couldn't say to parents they shouldn't be concerned. Is that correct?
Well, yes, except if a school, and I'll bring in straight away here the role of the local authority. I think this is key to this at the moment at least. The local authority still has a very, very active management plan working in collaboration with their local schools. They ought to be able to give quite a high level of assurance to parents in their area, working in cooperation with the schools, that things are safe.
You're saying they should be able to? Is that your belief that they are?
If they have a very well managed plan themselves.
And how many?
But we're talking for variation again, I think, between local authorities as between schools.
So are there local authorities whose practices are, to pick a word, unsafe, in your view? If so, who are they?
Not my local authority.
But you believe that there are some...
But I gather from talking to people in my authority who deal with asbestos that there is variable quality across local authorities.
Thank you. I'm going to bring Julie now.
Okay. Well, I'm a parent of children in a secondary school that has a lot of asbestos in it, and I'm also a former health and safety governor of a primary school and also a former chair of governors. I think what I understand about asbestos is significantly more than your average governor, if you might put it that way, and your average chair of governors. So I do know that there are risks, and I do know that in some schools they're not being controlled. I do know that the HSE intervened in 2004 in Thurrock Council, and they identified that there was dangerous asbestos fibres being emitted, and they called for the council to take action. When the HSE did their survey of a sample of schools in 2010 and returned back to that school, they found that they'd done nothing. So even with input from HSE and a directive to take action, schools have other priorities, and I think that because they're unique places, because of the number of children in them, they really need some help on this issue, because it's not an issue that's high up on the agenda for most schools.
Okay, and I didn't get any yes/nos to my should parents be concerned, but I guess Michael's was a clear yes, but they didn't use the word. And Julian, you said you weren't sure, was that right?
Well, I mean, the average exposure level now, when I say now, I mean in 1980, we've got no data on what it is now, but the average exposure level 30 years ago, I mean after asbestos has stopped being used.
You're going to take me a long way away from yes and no, aren't you, Julian?
Well, there are now 400 deaths a year in women from mesothelioma, and most of those are from asbestos in buildings. I mean, a good two-thirds of them are caused by asbestos in buildings. It is reasonable to assume that a fair fraction of that is due to asbestos in schools, because what happens to you when you're young is worse than what happens to you when you're old in terms of causing cancer. So it's reasonable to say that something of the order of 100 or 150 mesotheliomas a year in women now could be due to asbestos in schools in the 1960s, 1970s, okay? And if the levels now are 10 times lower than they were then, it's reasonable to assume that will go down by a factor of 10. So there might be, I mean, in 50 years' time, under current conditions, there might be 20 or 30 deaths a year in women and 20 or 30 a year in men from mesothelioma caused by asbestos in schools. And if that's distributed across all schools, it would simply be too expensive. I mean, it's brutal. You know, cost-benefit analysis must apply at some level. I mean, to prevent about 50 deaths a year, you can't rebuild all the schools in Britain. And these are deaths which occur predominantly over the age of 70. I mean, the fact that childhood exposure, you have to remember that. And that's a brutal fact. But if it's true that there were some schools...
I don't see it as that brutal, Julian. I think squeamishness about cost-benefit leads to misallocation of funding, which costs lives because people get carried away on one particular fashionable thing, and it is important to be rational in the limited resource that we have.
But if there are some schools, and there must be some variation between the schools, and if there are some where the levels are significantly higher and they can be identified effectively, then it's worth doing that. What it's not worth doing, in my opinion, is spending a huge amount of money in all schools. But if you can identify the ones where the risk is high, it's worth identifying and doing something about it, but it's not clear to me that you can.
Okay, thanks. Craig wanted to come in.
Can I just briefly touch base back on the local authorities' responsibility to, I think it's a management plan was the word used. Is there no set type of data that they use in such a plan, and would that not be consistent throughout the country?
There certainly is a set format they should be using, but in fact not all local authorities do use the same format. For instance, one of the things they're meant to have an asbestos management plan that is specific for a school. And some local authorities, in fact, they have generic asbestos management plans. So if you look at two of their schools, you'll see that most of it is exactly the same, which is completely wrong, because of course there's an awful lot of verbiage in it that doesn't actually apply to that specific school. So no, there is a format they're meant to follow, but no, many of them don't. And Mr. Chairman, in answer to your last question, there are a number of local authorities where the whole local authority has had enforcement action carried out against it for failures to manage asbestos.
How many do you know?
Well, once again, the HSE has only looked at a limited number of local authorities, and so one can't say, I could give you a few examples, but that's...
thank you. We've got a lot to get through and very little time, but Bill had indicated a quick question.
Very quickly, well, it probably isn't very quickly, but how do parents know whether a school is safe or not, or relatively safe or not?
I think that's a really good question, Mr. Esselstyn. In the USA, in 1980, they carried out an assessment and an audit of the asbestos in their schools. And as a result of that, they actually were more concerned, not less concerned. And so what they did is they realised, because schools contain huge numbers of pupils, that they were special places. And so they actually developed special regulations so that asbestos was properly managed in schools. And one of the things that they did make mandatory is an annual report to parents, so that parents knew about where the asbestos was, but also knew what plans there were in place to maintain it, keep it safe. And it didn't result in a panic, but it does mean that parents are well informed. And if you like, having a parental overview in a school is usually proactive.
Neil.
It's a nice question about management plans, and the fact that you should have one specific to a school. Shouldn't governing bodies be taking responsibility for this and actually having a plan which identifies the asbestos, knows what needs to be done in certain situations, and has a long-term strategy to sort of mitigate against further problems?
For the record, before I take an answer, did I see all four of you nod? Is that assent to that from all four of you? Julian, were you nodding?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Excellent. Michael wanted to come
in. The problem with governors, and it's a particular problem, we have asked a number of Parliament, or the MPs have asked a number of parliamentary questions about it. There is particular concern about governors, because, of course, taking on the responsibilities of asbestos. Because, of course, now with more than 2,700 academies, the responsibility for setting the priorities and deciding how they're going to manage the asbestos rests on the governors. Now, without training, mandatory training for governors, certainly it's anecdotal evidence, but governors do not have the training, they do not have the awareness to be able to say we've got to prioritise asbestos. And you can imagine, particularly with academies, they're taking on the liabilities of asbestos without being truly aware of what liabilities they're taking on.
Roger wants to come in first.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Governing bodies and head teachers have got 1,000,001 priorities, and every pressure group, of course, thinks theirs is the most important. I'm going to keep coming back to the role of a middle tier, let's call it local authorities for the moment, shall we? There has to be something local sitting above governing bodies if I really feel this is going to work properly. The idea that you have 24,000 individual schools and then the health and safety executive going in and doing inspections, I can't see working. It's about the local authority.
Thank you. I must move on, Pat.
Thank you. Can I specifically ask you about children? We have heard a lot about teachers, but the APPG report on asbestos in schools told us that children, because they're still developing, because their lungs are more susceptible, and the American study said 9 children will die to every 1 teacher. Is that something that you would agree with? The American study, the recent American, I think that Julie referred to, told us that for every teacher that dies, there'll be 9 children. Is that something that you would agree with?
It's certainly more than 1. I mean, whether it's 9 or 3 or 5, but it's substantially more than 1. I mean, the risk is not to the teachers, it's to the children. That's the fundamental point. That if asbestos in schools is a concern, the teachers are not the primary issue. The children are the primary issue.
So children are more susceptible.
Because they're more susceptible, yeah. I mean,
merely because of the incubation period being so long.
The risk just goes on.
They'll live long enough.
The risk goes on going up. I mean, the national death rate is higher at sort of 85 than it is at 80. I mean, once you've been exposed to asbestos, the risk goes on increasing for the rest of your life, very, very steeply.
So is it
very long latency?
Is it the length of time, the incubation period, or is it because they're young and developing and their lungs are more susceptible?
No, there's no good evidence that they're particularly susceptible at all biologically, but there's very, very good evidence that living 20 years longer after exposure vastly increases your risk. So that's the fundamental point. I mean,
Julie, do you feel differently?
I just would like to say that I don't think that there's no good evidence. I think there's conflicting and incomplete evidence about the physiology of children and the impact of asbestos. We actually know very little about how mesothelioma develops. In either adults or children. What we do know is that there's a cumulative effect, so the more fibres you're exposed to over a longer period of time, the worse the risk. So I would say that the evidence is incomplete rather than that there's no good evidence.
Michael?
Can I just say that certainly some American studies said, particularly with small children, very young children, and my wife used to teach children that frankly I thought were probably slightly too young to be at school because they were 3-year-olds, and they sat on the floor a huge amount. And in that one of the particular schools my wife taught in for 6 years, every single day they would sit on the mat to play the guitar and play in various things. And the asbestos was being managed every single day. And also young children, of course, they put their heads on desks. And if they're contaminated, and we do know in some cases that desks and furniture is contaminated with asbestos, then young children, purely because their faces are closer to the asbestos, they will breathe it in.
Okay, thank you. Moving back to the adults, is there any evidence that teachers, adults in schools, are more at a higher risk than people working in other buildings?
I believe there is, because certainly if you look at female primary school teachers, the latest proportional mortality ratio, the incidence of their deaths, is 119, and that the average for all people in every occupation is 100. But then if you compare it, for instance, of female nurses, now the present rate is 85 for female nurses, but between 1980 and 2000, the proportional mortality ratio for female school teachers was precisely 100, and for female nurses it was precisely 50. And so, in other words, the school teachers, which you're looking at two professions with equivalent number of people, slightly more nurses and teachers, the teachers were dying at a considerably greater rate, and they still are, than the female nurses. And also, if you look at males, if once again you compare male teachers with somebody who's not been in a building, and if you look at farmers, for instance, and in Professor Peter's evidence, the farmers, you'll see the PMR of farmers is 27 and farm workers is 17, compared to 66 for male teachers. And so, yes, male teachers are being exposed. Compare like-for-like occupations with males, and consistently for the 1980s, since the occupational statistics came out, male teachers have had a higher PMR than equivalent occupations such as doctors or solicitors. And so it's not a huge difference with males, but consistently they've had a higher PMR.
The other thing about statistics, I think that it's important to realise that this is an issue about asbestos in schools, so there are other occupants that are involved, and we don't have full data. We don't have any statistics for pupil deaths, and we don't have complete data for support staff deaths. So if you're talking about the whole issue of the whole school environment and exposure in the population, I think the statistics can, you can't rely on them wholly in cost benefit analysis. You have to think about everybody that's exposed in schools.
I'd just like to comment on what Michael said, because it's the only thing I disagree with him about, actually. The thing is that nurses and farm workers, I think, are exceptional. Farm workers and farmers are exceptional because they're the one identifiable, but there's a few others, forestry workers as well, but I mean, that spend most of their time out of doors. And the point is that that it is clear that asbestos in buildings was the main source of environmental exposure, and that caused an appreciable fraction of cases, about 15% of male cases, but about 30-40% of female cases, if you include domestic exposure. So asbestos exposure in buildings, I'm sorry, 60-80%, I mean the majority of female cases, were caused by asbestos in buildings. And the question is whether schools are more dangerous than other buildings, not whether buildings are dangerous. So the fact that farm workers have low risks simply reinforces the evidence that asbestos in buildings was a cause of mesothelioma. And the fact that nurses have lower than average female rates, not only marginally, but they do, reflects the fact, I think it's very strong evidence, that hospitals, where they spent most of their time, had less asbestos in them than average buildings. And so they're exceptional. But if you take the generality of buildings, offices, homes, schools, I mean, the question is whether schools are more dangerous than those other buildings and what proportion of the exposure came from them. Okay?
Are you able to tell us whether it's because more schools built since 1962 or whatever
I don't think you can't.
Or is it because they're not managed properly?
You can't. It's not a general issue. Anecdotes about sort of children sitting on the floor when the school was built are completely irrelevant. The asbestos wasn't put in 1862. The asbestos was put in after the war. That's when all the andesite board went into buildings in Britain, but in 1950 and 1975, and that's when it was all put in. It's got nothing to do with how old the building is. As I say, the crucial issue is how you identify whether or not there are some schools where the risk is higher than in others, not how you go about approaching all schools. You don't know what the problem is. I'd just like to make one other point. In relation to the PMRs, the PMR of 119 for female teachers is based on 53 deaths over 9 years, compared with 45 expected. It's not remotely significant. And in fact, if I hadn't updated my data, because I mean these data came out last Thursday, there's a typo at the bottom of page, middle of page 2. It says 119 for female secondary teachers. They should be primary teachers. It's correct in the table. But I edited this very hastily because I had 1 hour to do it before I resubmitted my evidence. But I mean, the data up to 2005, which when the original version I submitted showed a deficit in female teachers. I mean, the random variation is a major issue when you're talking about 53 deaths in 9 years. I mean, I don't think it's true that there's any evidence that teachers are at higher risk than other women.
Briefly, Michael.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it's highly relevant that generally across the board people are dying, and particularly if you look at females, and the one thing that everybody does is go to school. And if we all are in agreement that people are being exposed to asbestos in schools, what we're speaking about is the degree of the number of people who are dying. I think everyone accepts that people are dying in schools, and the only argument here is how many people are actually being killed from their exposure in schools. So people are being exposed, they are dying.
And for us, of course, what exactly we do about it. So we need to have that's why your evidence today is great on trying to get better understanding, but at our end, we've got to make sure that we get the right rules, the right priorities and the right regulations in place.
It's absolutely essential that the government assesses the scale of the problem, and to assess the scale of the problem, as I said in my first part of the evidence, they have to include asbestos in the property data survey programme. They've excluded it, and it's not too late to include all the evidence that local authorities and schools already have. So that particular proposal, it's got to be included. Do you agree with that, Julian? As briefly as you can, preferably with a yes or no.
Well, what specific?
This is that asbestos should be included in the property data survey.
I
It's
think
specifically not included.
I don't know. I don't know what the best approach is. It's not just a matter of having a survey. I think there should be measurements to see what people are breathing in. I don't think the property services surveys answer the question. I really don't. I'm not sure that they're well done. I don't know whether or not they capture what matters. What matters is what people breathe in. And there are two ways of measuring that. One is to measure it in their lungs, and one is to measure it in the air. And we're measuring it in lungs, which I think is useful. And we showed a 50-fold reduction from people born in 1945 to people born in 1980 in the amount of asbestos in people's lungs. But that doesn't tell you what variation there is between schools.
Right. Roger wants to...
I agree it would be a good idea to include it if it's a question of incorporating the data that local authorities should hold. I don't think it would be a sensible use of public money to do a separate survey.
No,
I don't think anyone's asking for that.
No, we're not asking.
And I'm thinking that actually, if that was included, then it would also serve a double purpose potentially of reviewing how effective the current audits of asbestos across authorities are.
Thank you. Julie?
It has to be included because if it isn't, the financial forecast that will come from that about managing the school stock will be meaningless.
Thank you. Neil?
Thank you. Do you agree that the DFE policy, asbestos in schools, which is in good condition, should be effectively left undisturbed?
Julie? Oh.
Okay. No, I don't agree. I think it's flawed for two reasons. The first reason is that it relies on asbestos being in good condition. I think there's enough evidence out there that the HSE has collected through its sample surveys to show that local authorities are not managing their asbestos effectively. We've got a school stock that's beyond its shelf life, with 80% of it in an unacceptable state. When they put asbestos into schools in the 1940s onwards, it would have been put into bonded products, and the products will be deteriorating. We're now more than 50 years on.
Sorry to cut you off, but we've got very limited time.
Julian, what would you say to that?
I certainly wouldn't. No, I wouldn't recommend doing anything if the asbestos is in good condition, beyond just keeping it painted and maintaining it, and not breathing in when you're drilling holes in it.
Thank you. Michael?
The problem is we don't actually know whether the asbestos is in good condition. There's well-known a case about system-built schools. About half the schools in the country are system-built. They found out in 1987 that it appeared as if the walls were in good condition. When they slammed the doors, they got 330,000 fibres, amosite fibres, being emitted from just slamming the door 5 times. The asbestos appeared to be in good condition. Jump forwards almost 20 years, and in class schools, it appeared as if the columns, which contain asbestos insulating board, structural columns, were in good condition. And it was only when they carried out air tests, and I agree entirely we should be carrying out air tests, that they actually discovered that the asbestos you couldn't see inside these columns was in bad condition.
Okay,
and it was only through air sampling they discovered.
Thank you. Shall we let Roger come in, Neil?
I'm not a scientist. I take advice. My gut feeling is that if it is really well managed, the evidence on balance shows that it's safe.
So really what this boils down to is you need to know more about each school in terms of the situation of the asbestos, and that comes down to the issue we raised before and you all agreed, is where governors should have a proper plan and a proper assessment of the asbestos situation in their schools.
Can I just take one point? I mean, the last page of my there's a graph, figure 1, which is the average level that we've seen in lung samples from essentially the general population. I mean, they're people with resected lung cancer or collapsed lungs, but I mean, they're the general population. And there's a 50-fold reduction from the people, men born in the 1940s to men born in 1975 to 84. And we haven't actually got any data on women because we haven't analysed their lungs yet, but we're going to. And I'm sure the women will show the same thing. I mean, they were still the same. They've always been below the men. And the point is that it's how much variation. There were two questions. I mean, if the level was 2,000 fibres per gram in the average person, born 35 years ago, what is it now? And we absolutely don't know that, and we're trying to find it out. But I mean, it's very, very expensive. It costs
so
about 2,000 quid per sample to do through the HSE to the electron microscopy. But that's a recommendation I'd appreciate. Tell the HSE to do some more electron microscopy.
Can I move on to the control of asbestos
But can I just make this point? It's very important. It's the key point. I mean, if the average level in British lungs was 2,000 fibres per gram 30 years ago, and it's a lot less than that now, it may or may not be, or even if it's at the same level, if it's at that level, we'd expect about, as I said, something of the order of 50 mesotheliomas a year in the future, forever, as a result of that exposure. If it's less than that, 5 times less, we'd expect 10 mesotheliomas a year. We've got 2,400 at the moment. I mean, the problem would be negligible at that level. And we ought to find out whether the problem is negligible before we spend any more money on it.
So essentially,
I mean, the problem could be completely negligible. And the two questions are: A, is 2,000 fibres a gram, is 50 deaths a year acceptable? Should we, what is it now? And secondly, crucially, are there some schools where the level's a lot higher? That's the thing.
So you want to know more about the overall level of asbestos and identify hotspots?
Yes, rather than some regulations which are very, very expensive and may not be effective. I mean, you want a very, very focused approach to identifying schools, if any, where the levels are much higher.
And you could do that by doing what? By your air tests?
I don't know. The trouble is, at the moment, the air sampling is so expensive. I mean, what I would recommend the HSE should do would be to, I mean, it's easier said than done this, but I mean, some procedure whereby you can take a very large volume air sample over a long time and then measure the asbestos fibres in it. And it's expensive, but I mean, it's probably not as expensive as what's being done now.
We have specifically asked, as part of the Department for Education Asbestos Steering Group, it was a proposal we put forward some while ago, that there is a trial carried out by the Department for Education and the HSE into widespread air sampling in schools, so that we could take very large volumes over a long period of time while the schools are occupied. And so we want a trial so that we can actually devise the system so you can do it effectively, so we could identify which schools are most at risk. And so it really answers your question. If we had that trial, then we could perfect a system to identify those schools at most at risk.
Yep. Okay, let's get on to the control of asbestos regulations 2012. Do you think they're adequate? Roger.
I'll keep coming back to my mantra. If the management system is effective, then I think they are. And if you have a well-worked system that is backed up by the local authority, good services provided. I spoke just yesterday to Sarah in the Barking and Dagenham Assets Department. She's worked on this for 11 years. She has every single detail at her fingertips. We have annual surveys of every single school, updated, if necessary, even more frequently, once every 6 months. All potential asbestos material is marked.
Are you spending a fortune on this?
etc., etc. So if it's done properly, then I think...
Are you spending, going back to the issue of proportionate spend, how much are you spending doing that?
How much do we spend?
Yeah.
3,800 a year it costs us to buy into that service via the local authority.
Per school?
That's a large secondary school. It would be much less for a small primary. It could be £500.
Julie, what do you think of the regulations?
I think they're inadequate. There is no statutory definition of the duty holder in the regulations. They don't require asbestos surveys to be mandatory, so a school can elect not to carry out a survey. The issue of competency is not clearly defined. There's no mandatory asbestos management training, and there's no asbestos awareness training for staff made mandatory. Because of all of those missing links, the management in schools has a wide range of competency, and I think the regulations urgently need review. But I think for them to be reviewed in an effective way, you have to acknowledge that schools are unique places because of the volume of children that they contain, and because they're at a higher risk, and I think they deserve specific regulation.
You have to set that against Professor Plato's...
I do. I'm a lawyer.
That's
it's my
useful.
legal answer.
That could well be useful, but it's not necessarily relevant to the question I'm about to ask, which is basically the balance of risk that we're hearing about, the overall level of asbestos, the identification of hotspots, the awareness of what actually is in specific schools against those concerns about the regulations.
I understand that. I also would, at this point, draw on the principle that where there's any sort of where there's any uncertainty, you should always err on the side of health and safety. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the issue of asbestos in schools, both scientifically, in terms of the statistics, and I think the HSE would advocate the precautionary principle, and I think that if we're going to improve management in schools, the way to do that is through regulation.
The HSE, as far as I know, has asked businesses and certainly farmers to have some sort of strategy for the management of asbestos roofs and so on that you'd find on farms or in many businesses. They're obviously satisfied with that, and I would expect all businesses of that type to have a plan. So the question arises, because we've already discovered that some schools do not have plans, so why not?
Because there's a wide range of competency, and if you don't have mandatory training for duty holders and staff, you're bound to get a wide range of competency on the issue of management of asbestos. And so some will know that it's good practice to get a survey and will get one, and others will say, well, the regulations don't require it and I'm not going to bother.
Okay, I think we probably need to move on.
I think that's fair enough.
Siobhan.
Can I make one point about the regulation? They would be tested. I mean, what you ought to do is you ought to take a sample of schools which, by virtue of their construction, are likely to have high levels. Do long-term sampling, and if you find any where the level is high, you should then systematically examine the way in which the regulations have been applied in that school and compare it with the sample of other schools. And the only thing that matters is how much asbestos is released. All this business about, I mean, I don't know who made these up. I mean, they knew less about asbestos than I did, and I don't know whether they're right. All the things that people should do. I mean, these regulations and irregular revision of risk assessment if circumstances have changed, it's just, I mean, it's legal nonsense, and of course it's very often not implemented. And what matters is whether or not kids are breathing in asbestos, and until you find that out, everything else is hot air.
Michael.
Can I just make one statement about inspections? Because you're speaking about we have to know whether schools are properly managing their asbestos. Well, specifically, proactive inspections has been removed. And so you're asking what you can actually do to practically address this. You ought to the government ought to reintroduce proactive inspections to see whether schools are effectively managing their asbestos. And there ought to be a system of inspecting all schools.
Well, Julian's point, I think, was more of a sample basis.
Oh, it was, and we are in agreement that you take the air testing, but I'm also saying that management goes with it as well. But I know we've heard if a school's not managing the asbestos, the chances are that the asbestos has been damaged.
Well, I just don't know whether or not these regulations have had much effect. I mean, people, we stopped using asbestos 30 years ago. I mean, it's gradually disappeared. Things get painted over. You know, I mean, asbestos exposures would have gone down anyway over 30 years after you stopped using it. And I don't know whether the regulations have any substantial effect on what's breathed in.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, one overriding concern that I do have is that, you know, in different construction types and within school buildings, there are many schools which are built to a type clasp as a for instance, where asbestos was used very extensively. I mean, in some clasp schools, an awful lot of panels below windows are euphemistically called kickboards, and they're actually constructed using asbestos. So, you know, dead easy actually just to punch through or to kick through, you know, and was something I'm afraid to say in some less orderly schools, it was something that was done on a regular basis. Asbestos panels being punched through or kicked through. But an awful lot of those schools still exist. So when it comes to examining schools, frankly, you could do some concentrated work looking at particular school construction types and save an awful lot of money, because if you find examples in one school, you'll know that exist in dozens and dozens of others.
Indeed you do, and I agree entirely, and that's precisely what happened about system-built schools, where they rediscovered this problem in 2006, where they found when you hit these columns, when you hit the walls, when you slam the doors, that you were getting 44,000 fibres per cubic metre of air emitted of amosite fibres into the rooms. But the remedy for that, and the health and safety executive say you're managing your asbestos successfully and effectively, if you just seal all the gaps and the cracks with silicon sealant, which to you and me is bathroom sealant, and we would advocate very strongly that is not a proper system of asbestos management. It is a short-term expedient, and I know of a particular school where I saw it one week, and it hadn't been sealed. The following week they had actually sealed this thing, or the following month they'd sealed it, and within a week after that the silicon sealant had been peeled off. And so if you are going to have systems of asbestos management, they have to be effective, and I agree entirely with particular types of school. They have a far greater risk than other schools.
Thank you. Siobhan.
Julie, you made some reference to it. Could you give us a bit more information on how the regulatory system for asbestos in schools in the UK differ from those arrangements in the US?
Yes, in the USA they have mandatory surveys with re-inspections of the asbestos-containing materials every 3 years. They develop and maintain an up-to-date asbestos management plan. We require just an asbestos management plan. It doesn't have to be maintained. It's mandatory. They have annual reports to parents, and they have periodic inspections. I think the best practice is every 6 months, where they have a wander around and do a visual inspection that supports the mandatory survey. But they also have mandatory training for the duty holder in management of asbestos, so that they have a high standard set, and they make sure that staff have mandatory asbestos awareness training, because when you're walking around the school, unless there's a little asbestos sticker on, or you've thought to look at the plan, you won't know where it is, so you won't know if a child is kicking a hole in something that they shouldn't, or it's a ceiling panel that's come down that has some asbestos in it. So I think all of those things that they do in the USA are things that we could take on board here, and that would help to improve asbestos management in schools, and hopefully would bring down the levels. But I totally agree with Professor Peter that the only way to know whether or not there is risk in school is to do the air sampling.
And again, we touched on this, but why do you think schools should have different regulations from other workplaces?
One simple answer is the fact they contain children. And absolutely everyone attends schools, so you're really looking at people. The Medical Research Council, as you saw in the 1997, they said they looked at the amount of asbestos in schools, and they said it's not unreasonable to assume that the entire school population has been exposed to asbestos in school buildings. And they also considered that that exposure would be a significant part of a lifetime exposure. And so you're looking at pretty well everyone in this country, a large proportion at a very young age being exposed to asbestos. They are a special case.
Given that schools are required to keep a regular updated asbestos register, why would a national audit of asbestos in schools be anything other than an expensive duplicate exercise?
Who'd like to do that? Julie?
A central collection of the data from the local authorities would mean that you could pinpoint in time the condition of the asbestos in the nation's stock, and then you could do proper forecasts and proper cost-benefit analysis. We don't know how much we spend on the management of asbestos in schools. We simply can't. The HSC can't tell us. We have asked that question. And we don't know how much it would cost to remove it. So if you have a starting point where you collect everything centrally and do an overview, you can work towards a phased removal over time.
Okay. And any resulting national register, should it be made public, wouldn't this cause a necessary alarm where asbestos is in a school but undamaged and highly unlikely to be disturbed?
I don't think it would cause panic or alarm. It didn't in the USA. You can only go on what's happened there, I think.
Roger?
I'd be very wary of this. It would have to be handled extremely carefully. if it was released step by step, for instance, so some schools asbestos was revealed before others.
But your authority with its super duper data, you can put your finger on everything, surely in the spirit of transparency it should be put on the web and made available to everybody.
If it was done for all schools on the same day, yes. But I don't have quite as much faith in some of our parent bodies in some parts of the country, and possible panic, which would be extremely disruptive and damaging to schools, individual schools.
Okay, we need to move on actually. I'm sorry. Chris.
I just wanted to clarify what proactive inspections will the HSE specifically involve, and what are the specific benefits of those proactive inspections?
The inspections the HSE have actually carried out in schools, they actually check to see whether the school has a proper asbestos management plan, a proper survey, and they are physically carrying out the actions that the asbestos management plan specifies. Because once you've identified the asbestos, the surveyor will say, this is in a dangerous condition, you've got to remove it immediately, or you can manage this and have a look at it every few months. And so therefore you've got to check that they've got that in place, and they are actually carrying out the procedures they say in the management plan. And so if the HSE carries out these proactive inspections, as I say, on a number of occasions they have identified schools and whole local authorities that don't have the management plans, that they haven't trained the people, they haven't identified the asbestos.
In terms of obviously recently decisions been taken that the HSE will no longer carry out proactive inspections in local authority schools, but they will begin to carry them out in academy schools. Obviously the explanation being that there may not be such greater regulation control over academies. Do you welcome that decision, or do you think there's a fault in that application?
But we certainly welcome it, but when you have a look, they're purely going to carry out the inspections of 150 schools. And we're speaking in England alone, yet that's the whole of the United Kingdom, the whole of Britain, in fact. You're looking at 34,000 schools in the whole of Britain. And so it is a very, very small fraction. Yes, of course we welcome any inspection, but it's just a one-off.
Anyone else? Roger?
Look, I mean, I'm just about to open a free school, so I'm not at all against autonomy for schools. However, I think this is one of those few areas where it is best, most efficiently done by the local authority. If the one change, coming back to your earlier question, change in regulations, that actually thinking about it would probably be sensible in this new landscape, would be to give local authorities this key role, including over those schools who are no longer directly under their control in this particular area, so that the HSE could then inspect the authority who would have had the responsibility and the power to inspect even the academies and free schools.
And for the record, Julie and Michael, you both nodded then, you're both in agreement with that. There's a case, I don't need any explanation, I just need you to nod. Thank you.
So we've seen the replacement of the Building Schools for the Future programme with the Priority Schools building programme. Has that increased any risks posed by asbestos in schools?
It has indeed, because the Building Schools for the Future initiative was purely looking at secondary schools, but in fact here, at a parliamentary debate, the Minister stated that in major refurbishments under the Building Schools for the Future initiative, they would remove all the asbestos. Now, in the Priority Schools building programme, there is insufficient money to totally refurbish schools, and therefore we asked the question when this government came in about what are you going to do about removing asbestos when schools are refurbished, and the answer came back that it's better to leave it in place and manage it than it is to remove it, and that's when schools will be refurbished. So I'm not saying not some of them are not going to remove it, but it is not a policy to remove it, which we feel it should be a policy to remove it.
And in terms of the department itself, obviously they've set up this steering group on asbestos in schools, it seems like about November 2010. Do you think that will have an impact on government policy, or is it having an impact?
Set up what?
The steering group, apparently. The Department of Education.
I see, the Department of Education steering group. Yes, indeed, it's had a huge effect because we're able to have an input into it. And in fact, we've worked exceedingly well with the Department of Education and the Health and Safety Executive. And what's come out of it is the fact that guidance has been issued to schools about asbestos. And so it's highly constructive, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Can I thank you all very much for giving evidence to us today. We haven't managed to cover all the ground we wanted to, so I hope we may, if we feel necessary, be able to correspond with you if we don't think there were some questions that were already answered in your written evidence. But thank you very much indeed. That's been most illuminating.
Thank you. No problem.
I don't know that's a single school that has demonstrated a high level in sort of long-term sampling of what people do.
Yeah, that's what we want.
It doesn't feel that it exists.
If we could switch to the next panel as quickly as possible, please. Order, order. Good morning. Welcome, Minister, in what I think is your first appearance before this committee.
That's right. Thank you, Jim.
Despite having been the Schools Minister for some time, we're obviously failing in our
Let me off.
responsibilities of scrutiny, but we're delighted to have you with us today, and I'm sure it won't be the last time. And Mr. Ashton, thank you for joining us as well. I don't know how, well, I know, Mr. Ashton, you heard the whole of the last panel. Does the government know enough about the asbestos risk in schools in England?
I think we know more about asbestos as a toxic material than virtually any other, because it's been hugely studied, and because of its toxicity, it creates a large number of patients, victims, who can be analysed in the sorts of way that Professor Pito described. So we have a great deal of information. My first note of caution to the panel would be to be wary of extrapolating from...
Do you mean the committee?
The committee, I beg your pardon. Of extrapolating from the historical data, the exposures from the active asbestos world, as I view it, into the much more passive residual asbestos world that we now have 20 years after we banned it. I think you do need to be wary of simply extrapolating from one field to the other. It can lead to a number of quite misleading conclusions, but we do know a great deal about asbestos, yes.
My question wasn't do we know how much we know, it was whether we knew enough to be confident of the risks that children in particular face in our school buildings.
Yeah, actually I had an unfashionable answer so far this morning. I believe we do. We do know that it's very dose-related. And that you heard evidence to that effect this morning. So the more you breathe in, the more your risk. And that there's a long latency period, which clearly is significant if you're very young when you're breathing it in. It sits in your lungs for longer before you die of something else than if you were middle-aged when you were breathing it. We do know the sorts of exposure levels that cause the current large number of mesothelioma deaths. We can clearly see from the epidemiology that certain professions are not at increased risk, but we're all at risk because of being born in the 20th century when asbestos was being used. That's just a circumstance of being on the planet at this particular time for all of us. The epidemiology, a point that wasn't made this morning about epidemiology, but which I would like to refer to, is that where death certificates show mesothelioma teacher, simply to go from that to work out the risk to teachers is to make quite a significant mistake, because the last known occupation of somebody who's died because of exposure over a period of 40, 50 years of their life is not sufficient information to conclude firmly that they died because they taught in schools where there was asbestos. At that age, they lived in a community where asbestos was very much more actively used, including by the building trades who put it into those schools, who stripped it out of ships and all the other things which people like myself inspected at that time, what I call the active asbestos era. So to work, not to know their full history, but to assume a link from their final cause of death, their cause of death to their final occupation, invites you to make a misleading policy decision. People like myself who've had quite large asbestos exposures would have civil servant, or in my case it would say senior civil servant on my death certificate, with whatever cause eventually. But it's not that doesn't tell you that being a civil servant exposed you to a harmful level of asbestos. being a health and safety inspector in the west of Scotland in the 1970s and 80s did, and that's my biography, that of my colleagues, and I use that to point the spotlight on myself to emphasise that conclusions simply drawn from the fact that some teachers died from mesothelioma, therefore there's an elevated risk to the teaching profession and to the children in schools, is a very questionable assumption to base policy on.
Except, Mr. Ashton, that most teachers are teachers throughout their professional lives. We are only just getting to a stage where people tend to use teaching as a second career, or, you know, most of my own experience from people I know who are teachers who have died of mesothelioma, that has been their career.
Yes. And they've lived through the active asbestos era where an example would be in a particular town in the west of Scotland, which I wouldn't mention. Teachers who were teaching at that time, in about 1980, were working in schools which contained asbestos. They also lived in a community where the Ark Royal was dismantled, just in the port. And it was, as they said at the time, stuffed to the gunnels with blue asbestos because of the fire precautions, which is a key reason for using asbestos. If you had an infinitely detailed knowledge of where their fractional exposures had been over the course of that life, you would find, and this is not me only using the anecdote of that shipyard, which I was the inspector for. Professor Peto's evidence of how much asbestos dust there is in the lungs of people, and a 50-fold reduction in younger people because they weren't alive in that active asbestos era when it was being handled by the building trades, demolition trades and so on, all-rounders. That's a very significant piece of scientific epidemiological evidence.
Thank you very much. Minister, in preparing for today, you've obviously had a read up on this, reflect on it. What are your thoughts on broadly on where we're at in policy terms? We've got the regulations that came in last year. We had fairly scathing criticism by some members of the last panel. Just wondered where you're at.
Yeah, I think I'd summarise my position, the government's position, in this way. I mean, if you look at the evidence that the HSE gave to you in paragraph 55, that summarises what I think is the advice that we're getting at the moment, what is the position that previous governments have taken, and it explains the thinking behind existing policy. And it basically says, without taking up too much time, that where airborne asbestos fibre tests have been conducted to measure or replicate the normal occupation of buildings, including schools, such testing confirms that the release of fibres into the air is normally 100 to 1,000 times lower than the control limit in the latest regulations, provided asbestos is properly managed. Therefore, as long as asbestos is managed properly, teachers and pupils are not likely to be at risk in the course of their normal activities. Now, I think you know, Chairman, that my predecessor, Nick Gibb, undertook to do a review of asbestos policy after the Committee on Carcinogenicity, not easy to say, reports, I hope quite soon. I've had a letter from the Chairman recently indicating that they hope to agree the report at their next committee meeting on May the 9th. So we are going to review our policy after that. And I think there'll be three things in particular that I'll want to look at. Firstly, obviously, the advice that committee of experts gives us, and the issue about longevity even at low levels of exposure. So that is the latest and best medical evidence that will be available to us. Secondly, I think obviously the report that you're going to do, I assume that you will do one after these hearings. And I think also...
Just for the record, we...
may or may not.
This is a one-up to look at the issue, and then the committee will reflect on whether that's necessary or not.
Well, any thoughts, obviously, that you produce we'll look at closely. And I think the third point that was raised in your evidence session earlier on, which we may also pick up some useful evidence on when the HSE conducts its random survey of 150 autonomous schools, is the question that one of your witnesses raised earlier, which is the existing presumption that the duty holders will be the local authority and local authority schools, governing body or academy sponsor in those cases. Is that a robust and good assumption? That are they doing the job properly, and does the work that the HSE do in inspecting those types of institutions show that they have the same robust controls that we would expect from local authorities?
Thank you. David?
I'm somewhat confused now. Do we have a problem in schools, as far as you're concerned, in terms of asbestos?
We have a problem which can be dealt with by some fairly mundane acts of management, routine preventive acts, which are actually what are captured in the control of asbestos regulations. And echoing perhaps the first question of the morning,
Well, we've heard criticisms of those regulations this morning.
you heard one criticism, which was that they should be replaced with sampling, which we disagree with. Sampling is a snapshot. It would be in the order of £5,000 to £10,000 per school to carry out the sort of sophisticated sampling which would give you meaningful information. The much less expensive sampling, which is called phase contrast microscopy, which is done at the end of an asbestos job, it's a bit of quality assurance that a removal job's been done reasonably well, backed up with visual examination. It was from that Mr. Lees extrapolated the rather alarming figures about a school called Cumcarn. We did electron microscopy in that school, and our advice to the local authority there is that it's perfectly safe to reopen that school, because the actual levels by that more sophisticated method were at the limits of measurable quantification by a more sophisticated technique. So the one criticism you heard of the regulations was that they should be replaced with sampling. I don't think that would be useful. I think we would prove a negative, whereas the regulations are asking for positive management of a problem.
Thank you, David.
So that the scale of this problem, are we actually aware of the scale at the present time, do you feel?
Yes.
What exists, what form it's in,
yes.
How it's managed?
Yes, a very large amount of asbestos was used in many premises throughout the UK over many years. I think it was 3 million tonnes. So we have a large legacy amount of asbestos, and maybe a third of it's been removed and the other 2/3 is still there.
So do we need a national, you use the word maybe, do we need the national audit? Do we need to know school by school?
We wouldn't find that useful. If others felt it was a good use of their time and money to do that, we wouldn't object to that. But our advice is that this should be dealt with school by school. There is very clear advice on how to contain the problem to prevent this fibrous mineral dust from escaping into the air. The precautions, it does need vigilance over the many years in which the asbestos is present in the schools, and that brings certain issues of reliability in management and corporate knowledge, which we would see as being solved by good records at the level of the school, updated as things change.
So how do we know all of that is being done without a national audit? School by school?
Well, from some general conclusions about the significance of asbestos in schools, we can attempt to answer your initial question about how concerned parents should be. For instance, and we are a government agency, we're not a lobby group here, so we take the evidence. We also have rather world-class laboratories doing the electron microscopy work in Buxton. We take that information and we draw general inferences from it, and we suggest these are positions of general relevance. They include, for instance, that the normal air movement drafts in a school which has a false ceiling of asbestos tiles above which there is debris. The normal air movement will not create measurably increased levels of asbestos for the occupants of that school, and that's based on the more sophisticated form of microscopy. So we don't go to every school to reprove that. We offer that from the scientific knowledge we have as a general and broadly reassuring conclusion about the mere fact of spending your time in a school which contains asbestos does not create significantly elevated risk by virtue of the movement of air. To make the fibres airborne and to create the risk, it's the application of physical force by hand or machine that greatly increases that risk.
So as a parent, how do I know in my local school? How would I know it's safe?
The first question would be the age of the school, because newer than a certain age it will contain no asbestos because of the prohibition. If it's older than that and it was of sufficient concern that as a parent you wish to have reassurance, the school ought to be able to answer some fairly simple questions. We've captured the essence of them on a one-page asbestos management checklist for schools. So a very concerned parent, I mean, perhaps myself, for instance, knowing what I know about asbestos. Actually, I was a primary school governor at the school my children went to, and it did have asbestos, so it was on the east side track. But a parent could choose to ask these broad questions, and I would agree with the evidence that was submitted in the earlier session about one ought to hear positive answers from the school about the existence, for instance, of an asbestos survey or a management plan, knowledge about where asbestos was, so that when contractors come in to disturb it, which is the risk phase, they are given the advice and the warning so they do that safely. And the parent could ask that directly, perhaps, or it could be done through the governing body on which people are represented.
Move on, David.
Can I just ask then, because it links with the last point about being disturbed, and does the existence of asbestos in schools, does that fit in any way with the school's building investment programme at all? Is it a consideration when looking at investment in school buildings?
The existence of asbestos? Only in this way. I mean, as you know, we've identified in the Priority School Buildings programme the 261 schools in the country that we think are in the worst state, and that is just about the overall state of their buildings, not specifically asbestos issues. We are then basically going to rebuild all of those schools from scratch, and so any asbestos issues that arise in them, and I'm sure many of them will have asbestos in them, will be dealt with. Otherwise, what we're doing is we are doing a survey, as you know, of the entire school's estate, but that is also focused on general maintenance issues, and it's rather than the existence of asbestos, and it's focused on that for two reasons. One is that to really find out a lot about asbestos' existence, we'd have to do really quite intrusive surveys, which we're not doing. And the other thing is that the clear advice that we've got from the HSE is actually that provided the existing asbestos is safely and responsibly managed, it is safe for pupils and teachers, and arguably safer than if we start digging around and exposing some of it. The real risk seems to be particularly when contractors and others go in and do bits of discrete work on a school, which could not only endanger them, but endanger people in the school if they come into proximity of the byproducts of it.
Okay, thank you. Siobhan.
This is slightly covered, but why is asbestos not included in the property data survey, which will in future be used to allocate funding for school maintenance?
Yes, I mean, it does link into the last question. I mean, firstly, because we think there are already duty holders who have a responsibility to do this job, and the nature of the survey that we're doing in those schools is very much a visual one. To get very detailed information about the existence of asbestos in these schools, we'd literally need to go around with quite intrusive surveys, and we'd need to dig around in the school buildings and elsewhere, which would not only raise the cost, but potentially even raise, endanger and destabilise some of the materials that are there. In terms of this survey, it might be helpful if I very briefly give you some information about it, because I know it did come up in the earlier questioning. In England, we've got just under 23,000 educational institutions that will be part of the survey. Around about 3,000 of those won't be surveyed because they're essentially modern buildings that are in a good state. So we've got about 20,000 that will be. Of those, a little bit over 8,000, we're relying upon data which has been sent in by local authorities from their existing surveys of the condition of their schools, which means that we will actually be surveying probably something like 11,000 or a bit over 11,000 schools. And incidentally, we will have completed, as at the end of this month, around about 7,500 of those surveys. So just to be clear, that there are a few schools which are very modern and we're not looking at because we don't expect them to have any significant maintenance needs. And there are a large block where we're actually using the existing local authority survey data. But this survey, for the reasons I've given, is focused on basic school condition problems. It's not an attempt to have an intrusive survey into the existence of asbestos.
Okay, so would you say the decision to exclude asbestos was deliberate?
Yes, I'm sure. I mean, obviously this survey was established and agreed some time ago, and therefore I can't anticipate precisely what was in the minds of the people who made the decision. But my understanding is it was an explicit decision to construct the survey in this way in order, A, not to have a very intrusive survey, and B, not to have one which would be unnecessary, since we already have duty holders who have these responsibilities.
What assessment has the government made of the change in asbestos risk resulting from the replacement of the Building Schools for the Future programme with the Priority School Building programme?
And we haven't made any assessment other than the broad assessment that we make as a conclusion of what the HSE has said to us, which is that where asbestos is in place, which it appears to be in most of our schools, 3/4 seems to be the figure widely used, it is safe, provided it is maintained properly. So the switch over from Building Schools for the Future to the Priority School Building programme, to the extent that the Priority School Building programme has had to be smaller because of the economic circumstances, will mean that there won't be as many schools that potentially will have as larger piece of work done on them. But provided the other schools are being properly maintained, which is the key issue, there shouldn't be any materially heightened risk.
Thank you. Alex.
Local authorities, they hold the ring on a lot of this stuff. I mean, they've got the expertise, the understanding, and they've worked with schools for many, many years. But now we see the responsibility dissipating across free schools, academies, and others. Have you any additional concerns about how it is managed into the future in the light of that, Minister?
Yes, I mean, that's an issue that I will certainly keep under review and look at closely, A, when we hold this review that I mentioned earlier on to all of you, and also when we get the information back from the HSE about the study that they're carrying out. You'll probably know that they carried out 2 studies previously, one under the last government in 2009-10 on local authorities, which targeted the local authorities that looked riskiest in terms of the information that came back. And they ended up taking enforcement action actually against 10 of those, I imagine, 42 authorities that they focused on, therefore 10 out of 152. They also did a survey then of 164 academies, independent schools, free schools, and they found issues, I think, with about 17% of those. So I think the survey that the HSE will be doing in an era when we are getting a more autonomous school system will be important, and not only to the HSE, but for the government to look at and draw any conclusions from.
Yeah. If you're finding such a large proportion, I mean, you said 17%, but if there are issues in those places, don't you think that the argument being made by the people we had of earlier for a full survey involving asbestos, and checking for asbestos, would be the correct thing to do?
No, I'm not sure it would, because I think the key thing is for us to make sure as a department that we don't unnecessarily replicate in an unrealistic way, which we'd have to keep on doing every few months if we were really going to nationalise the whole problem, the work that's been done at a lower level. What we have to make sure is that the checks in the system are actually working. David might want to say more about some of the actions that they took after the earlier surveys of local authorities and of academies and free schools. My understanding is that quite a lot of the problems that they found and identified weren't necessarily that they were finding enormous bits of exposed dangerous asbestos. It's just that some of the many boxes that they rightly have to tick to demonstrate that they've got management plans in place, regularity of inspection and so forth, did not meet HSE full requirements. So I don't think we should necessarily draw from the figures I gave the conclusion that we've got vast numbers of schools across the country that are dangerous to children. If there were, then we would be very concerned indeed, but that's not the information that I'm getting from the HSE.
David? I think, David? Sorry, I was just going to say, at the simplest level, one my concern is that in these days of autonomous schools, a keen caretaker or site manager will decide, yes, we'll take that wall out. And they take that wall out, explore, with problems related to asbestos. So is 12 pages of online training really sufficient, to guide people properly, that they shouldn't actually think, oh, we can now take this wall out or that wall out? How do we make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, I think they have a very, very clear duty, and they have the responsibility still to have an asbestos management plan. They have the clear guidance from the department. They have the guidance that we published in October last year for head teachers and governors about how to manage asbestos properly. So I don't think anyone can be in any doubt whatsoever about the importance of this and the responsibility. But I think it's perfectly sensible, particularly if there's an evidence base, for the department to reflect on a more autonomous school system, on whether it's satisfied that the checks and balances in a much more local authority system are still there in the future. I think that's a perfectly sensible question, and we should address that issue in our review and be informed by the work that the HSE is going to do, which is well timed, of precisely these schools.
Yeah. David said earlier on that you know, it would prove extremely expensive to start doing the full sort of survey that some people would advocate, and with something you've ruled out. Is it a cost factor in this at all?
It's certainly a cost-benefit factor, and I'd emphasise more the benefit, because what the HSE is saying to us is, you know, you could go round and do £10,000 surveys into 23,500 schools and drill into asbestos and try and find out how much is there. But A, if it's being managed properly, there shouldn't be a problem. That's what you should be checking. And B, if you go around drilling into asbestos walls, you might end up, you know, creating
you
far
make a very
worse
strong point, Minister. I mean, I'm just concerned about the ones that don't manage it properly. How do we know where it's not being managed properly and therefore there is a danger?
Can I link this then to one of my later questions? The 1 in 6 schools, according to Arrow, that's required enforcement action. That doesn't sound like ticking boxes.
No.
David?
Sorry, you've got two Davids.
Two Davids. Mr. Ashton.
Sorry.
Yes, when we do surveys of schools, and they are samples but statistically valid subsets, of course, so that we can multiply up and convince our statisticians that that's a valid thing to do. So 150 non-LA controlled schools this year, in the next 12 months, will be a sample from which we can draw robust.
That's where we have to leave our live coverage from the Select Committee rooms to go over to the start of the day in the House of Commons. You can carry on watching this committee live on our website at bbc.co.uk/democracylive.